All
Yep.
right, well, I'll get started here. And I did catch a bit of the conversation on Twitter, and it sounds like you're having a similar problem with MOOC attendance that MOOCs have, which is dropout as the workshop goes along. So welcome, I guess, to the final session of the event today. And sounds like from what I've caught on the Twitter feed, it's been an interesting discussion so far. I will keep a bit of an eye out on the chat as well, just to see if there's any questions or anything that arises in there. It looks like we've got a rather large room and folks spread out across the room. So what I'll talk about briefly, and I'll move through this a little bit quicker than I intended. We're a little late in getting the session started, and I'd like to move to questions where possible. So let me just begin by saying what I think is the broad perspective of MOOCs that I'd like to put forward, and that is the role that MOOCs play in the overall education sector. And probably to put it at as broad a view as possible, I would say that MOOCs are a supply-side answer to decades of change in the demand side of learning needs. And so I'll try and articulate a little bit more what I mean by that going forward. If you look briefly at some of the trends that are influencing various education sectors, and they are numerous. Let me just increase the window size here a little bit. So you look at one level, the rather substantial change that we've seen in the impact of funding and state funding or funding allocated at a provincial level. It's hard to overstate how dramatic some of those changes have been for the education sector. If you're just looking at the U.S. context, since 2008 to 2013, every sector, every state in the U.S. has seen cuts that range from around 3% to 50+% of funding allocations being reduced on a per student basis. Only Wyoming and North Dakota actually have had an increase during that timeline, and that's had fairly dramatic influence on the education sector as a whole. Additionally, one of the most rapidly growing elements of the education accrediting system has been certificates, and as I'll make the argument going forward, there's a reason why that's the case, and largely it's due to the fact that whereas much of the world has changed in terms of learning needs, the role of university still assumes itself at least to be that of serving a traditional student marketplace. In this timeline, while we've had budget cuts, we've also had very dramatic growth in the overall employment, sometimes classified as administrator bloat, whereas since 91 we've seen fairly stable timeline of faculty employment growth, yet we've seen dramatic increase in management growth. And so we have a university system on the one hand that is under a lot of economic pressure. We have changing needs societally around learning, and we have a management of university that's becoming more corporate-like on many levels. This isn't necessarily anything startling. It reflects a trend that is evident in the economy as a whole, which is that more and more of the jobs that are now emerging are in what would be called knowledge economy or knowledge work. Interaction, transaction jobs, creative industry work in the US, Germany, many regions of the world are now significantly the majority in those opportunities for employment. The population, if you look at the spread of population from the 1900s, where we had very much a youthful population and a fairly steady downslope, by 2010, as of today, that slope has changed quite significantly, and that's expected to change even more in the next 40-45 years going forward. And the reason I'm just referencing a few of these quick stats is I want to tie this together to my argument about the demand side of learning has been changing dramatically over the last several decades, but the supply side of learning needs has been very stable. If you evaluate the profile of students in the US higher education system, less than half of students now fit into a full-time student profile. And that's quite a dramatic change, where historically, if we had draw an image of an ideal student, you would probably look at someone who's anywhere in the range of the 18 to 24, 25 year level, or age level, because that would be the profile that we would expect a student to hold at that level. That's changing because that student and the notion of even students of that age being a regular full-time student, that fits into a minority category now. And if you consider university entrance rates, historically, higher education would serve a smaller sector of society. In 1995, for example, we had just under 40% on an OECD average of students entering universities. Now we're seeing student entrance rates around 60% in OECD countries. And what this essentially means is we have a very different type of student need. If you educate 10, 20, 30% of a student population, you are likely getting a lot of motivated students who are entering university for specific reasons, but as you increase your percentage of participation in society, all of a sudden you have a completely different structure of students, and that means you need to add additional support structures to meet the needs of those students. And I think you can see that reflected in the number of universities now that offer a huge range of support services for students, because our students no longer fit the profile that they once held in the past. When you're educating 60% of the population, you need to have a fairly diverse set of support structures in place for students. And so the argument very broadly is that the regular education system has not met the demand for university education. They have, I should say, they have in the future going forward, they haven't met that demand till now, but in the future going forward, they do need to meet this demand. And they also have to develop new programs for teaching and learning to help address this need of a diverse student population. Currently in the education sector, the university enrollment numbers are favoring women over men, almost the reverse of what it used to be 30, 40 years ago, where the university sector favored men over women. In the last 30, 40 years, that's basically flipped, and men are now minorities. The learners as a percentage base has increased dramatically. The entrance age is increasing in all university sectors. The top 3 countries for new students entering education sector, China, India, and the US. And interestingly, in spite of a lot of attention being paid to this, traditional science courses are waning in popularity, but we're seeing courses such as business or business-related fields actually growing in influence. And of course, there's a far greater profile of international students coming into the education sector. All of this comes in the corresponding increase of students within the higher education sector globally. And student numbers are expected to continue to increase, looking at in excess of 250, 300 million students in the next 5 years being involved in some level of the education sector. So let's get to MOOCs then. So what MOOCs reflect, you've got this backdrop of changing student profiles, changing funding pressures for university. We have a greater perspective of students entering education. We have a greater portion of our economy that is now driven by or influenced by knowledge work. MOOCs are the first significant contribution by universities to respond to this decades-long change in the supply side or the demand side of learning. So MOOCs are the first supply-side solution, and even though it feels like they've absolutely blown up in terms of popularity interest, which they absolutely have, it's important to note that it didn't happen in a vacuum, and that it's not MOOCs that are driving it necessarily. It's these factors that I referenced that underpin the growing need for MOOCs, but universities, in spite of these changes around society, have retained their focus on traditional students. Now, I'll make a slight transition here. Again, I'll move through this quickly because I know according to the schedule, I'm supposed to speak till about 4:15 and then spend time for Q&A, but I'll just move through this fairly briefly. So MOOCs then are an instantiation of a trend. They're a response to other factors. They're not the trend themselves. There are far bigger trends that shape education, ranging from openness in open education resources to open software, the growth of digital learning and online learning, the way that society, university leaders, as Sloan C reports indicate, have responded to digital and online learning. We're seeing smaller learning chunks, if you will. The transition to competency-based learning reflects that. Growing interest in using analytics to improve teaching and learning, the rise of the profit sector, various technology trends such as adaptive learning and wearable contextual computing, and then a few other factors that I'll spend a little bit of time chatting at briefly. I see Kurt is either smoking a long cigarette or has a pen in his mouth. This type of
take your time.
All right. So these are a few of the factors that we are looking at in terms of educational change, and these are the ones that are actually dramatic. You know, MOOCs themselves, I have no doubt in 2 or 3 years' time, MOOCs as a concept may well be what bell bottoms are to us today. This quaint little phase that we went through, or maybe, I don't know, Corey Hart in the 80s, or pick some band that is no longer cool. But MOOCs essentially reflect that. I think they've had too much hype to be sustainable as a concept or an idea, but don't worry about the MOOC terminology in itself. It's everything going on underneath that is driving the enormous popularity for MOOCs, and that's something that isn't going to change. That's something that universities have to adjust to, and whether it's MOOCs as a stepping stone to the next thing or whether it's something different altogether remains to be seen. The bigger issue, though, as I've mentioned, is that we are in an age where continual learning is needed, and the university sector has not been designed for continuous learning. It's been designed for periodic learning. 4 years of learning, get a degree, work, write checks to your university as an alum when you're done. And that's now changing, where learning is a constant, ongoing, lifelong process, and universities are not structurally designed to accommodate that. And that's reflected, if you look at MOOCs right now, the average age for MOOC takers, and this depends on which particular study you look at because the MOOC takers are diverse, but the average age sits at around the 30-plus year level. The University of Edinburgh report looked at MOOC takers having, on average, a bachelor's or even a master's degree. So these aren't sequential students that we've perhaps had in our universities in the past. Now, underpinning this has been the fact that we have always lived in networks or in a connected world, but we haven't been overwhelmingly aware of it because we've been, excuse my dog here, he periodically likes to join in conversations. So we have had a sequence where we're now explicitly aware of networks. We have, because of mobile devices, Facebook, Twitter, other tools, we know what it's like to be connected. And even though we've historically always been connected, it's explicit now. So a few arguments then is that knowledge primarily is this pattern of connections, and that when we create or build new knowledge, we do so by relating to what's already known, and that innovation means that we want to be open so that we can form connections and be involved in creating new knowledge. What I'm trying to get at here is that what universities have done in the past, serving the knowledge needs of society, they're going to have to be structurally different to serve the knowledge needs of society going forward. So if you look at the network model of knowledge creation, the diagram should be on your screen right now, the scientists or researchers are turning to networks as a way to understand complexity of a landscape, whether it's the internet or whether it is scientific collaboration or whether it is a particular molecular structure. Networks are surprisingly valuable models that help us understand what's going on in a particular topic or in a particular landscape. So if you look at papers that are visualized by how they're related, whether it's through co-authorship or through clustering around shared concepts or even extrapolating the research methods, whether it's about articulating the structural underpinnings of a particular knowledge landscape, networks are surprisingly versatile as a way for us to understand change and what's happening around change systems. This is a simple example of linked data, which is, I guess, another way of looking at the semantic web writ large. Understanding the future of universities requires, and innovation in the education sector requires, a recognition of these network underpinnings, and that's the future university models need to reflect those network attributes. One simple example of this is rocket, the steam engine, which arguably is one of the most significant inventions in human history. But if you actually look at it, I mean, rocket wasn't something that somebody sat down and invented in an afternoon or even a year or two and then shared with the world. Instead, rocket reflected a range of innovations, from steam and motion to wheels to transportation to just general scientific progress that was occurring at the time. Entrepreneurship, there was a capital base available to reward innovators and people who are willing to experiment, and the list goes on. So when we talk about an invention like the steam engine, much like we're now talking about MOOCs as an invention, what we're overlooking is that there are many different threads that develop that produce this particular outcome. So as Rosin wrote in his excellent text evaluating the development of the steam engine, is that there's literally 1,000 threads that lead from the beginning of really the modern world that ended up in the development of the steam engine. In the same sense, what we see with the steam engine, what we see with MOOCs, what we see with knowledge broadly, is it's really about stitching together a lot of different parts rather than something that's been developed 100% from scratch. So that's sort of point one, this notion of knowledge as a connective system, and that universities have to emulate that connectedness, and that even MOOCs are a reflection of long strands of innovation that go back to the earliest formation of distance education systems, and now online learning more recently, and today as MOOCs. It's not that there's so much a new thing as they are a particular cluster of activities that have been ongoing for a long period of time. So let's look at Apple. Apple is hailed as one of the more innovative companies of our era. In 2001, Apple released a fairly simple device. Certainly it was a very attractive piece of hardware, but basically it was a version of a Walkman that was just sleeker and stored more songs and had nicer user interface. I'm not sure how many of you recall the good old iPod wheel and how interesting it was when you first played around with it and how well designed it was. What happened is the iPod sold fairly well, but it wasn't until April when Apple released iTunes, specifically when they released iTunes for Windows in 2003, that things started to change. Once iTunes was released, Apple became, or started to become, an integrated ecosystem. And that integrated ecosystem became extremely valuable in supporting and sustaining Apple. 2005, additional features, TV shows, and so on were added. 2007, the barn doors blew off with the iPhone coming out. That completely changed the landscape. And so when we're talking about value and we're talking about university network models, we're really looking at how do we integrate systems that provide end users with substantial value. Because much like Apple did with its iPhone, iTunes, eventually iPad, and a variety of other services, as it created this integrated system, Google Play is doing something similar. Facebook has already done something with its identity management activities. Google Plus hasn't been as successful, but is still a player in the game. So all of these systems become valuable once they become an integrated structure. And that's been reflected in various aspects of higher education as well. If you look at the development of Stanford University, for example, it really came about as a result of Terman's work during World War II, where he was seconded to work on top secret military activities out of MIT or Harvard. When he came back to Stanford and he realized that during World War II, the military funding went almost exclusively to these prestigious universities, many of them in Eastern US, Stanford was really not a well-regarded university and not a university that had a lot of wealth. Terman's first task back was to change that, and he did that through the formation and development of an integrated ecosystem where he worked closely with startups, provided opportunities for faculty to create their own businesses, to commercialize their software. He connected well with the existing business community and so on. And as he began to create this integrated structure of knowledge and economy and startups and employment, that's when Stanford ended up becoming the significant or influential organization that it is today. And so in education, and to try and make this leap, in education we are seeing an unbundling of the network structures that higher education has had in the past. And I'm sure you've talked about this throughout the day today, so there may well be some repetition here. But universities historically were an end-to-end experience. Everything from your enrollment to your support services to teaching to learning to research to degree granting, all of that came in as a result of an integrated structure. That model, that network, is now unbundling, and we're starting to see, if you will, a rebundling of new models, and these are significantly different. So MOOCs right now are a keystone concept, a critical node that is helping to drive a reformulation of education models and the generation of new ecosystems. So at some level, we could say, whereas higher education has in the past been one entire integrated structure, it's now being pulled in different directions as you have systems like edX and Coursera and Udacity starting to question the view of teaching as we've traditionally known it. You have different universities, the Western Governors, some of the work going on with University of Wisconsin, competency-based learning, similar challenges there. You have corporate groups like Pearson that are providing curriculum and online learning development services to universities. You have open education services such as MIT and other open courseware projects that are opening up curriculum. So this once integrated, self-contained ecosystem is now literally coming apart at the seams, and the role of MOOCs right now, I think, is primarily to highlight that unbundling, because we really don't have a clue yet on how it will rebundle or what it will look like going forward. But there's definitely a power shift, because once the integrated ecosystem is challenged, then the traditional power structures are put under pressure. So we have everyone from state to public universities being concerned. We have academics and faculty worried that we're going to see a network effect where there'll be a small number of very big winners in the university lottery. We have faculty as a discipline losing influence, even though if you're a faculty member that teaches a course on Coursera and you get 40, 50, 60,000 students, you actually gain significant influence. So it's interesting where the professorate is losing influence, but individuals are gaining it. And you have a number of VC or venture capital backed entrants that are picking at this carcass of the integrated university system by offering specific products or services. And of course, all of this is coming against a bit of a backdrop where there are questions about, well, wasn't the internet supposed to liberate everyone and give learners control? And I think at some level that has happened, but perhaps not at the level it was envisioned. Now, in response to that, and in response to traditional university MOOCs that are reflected by the big providers, I think it's important to emphasize that MOOCs were initially conceived to be more of a web and less of a website. MOOCs were conceived not to be an integrated structure where one person could control everything, but rather loosely joined systems of learning and interacting, and a model that encouraged creativity, sharing, improving the ideas of others, rather than one that was primarily interested in learners duplicating what others already knew. So initiatives such as a domain of one's own have tried to reclaim a part of that early ideal. And much of what we should be doing in education now is there's no clear path forward. I'm a bit disconcerted that we've settled on MOOCs early as the path forward, because we should really have hundreds, thousands of projects blooming, but unfortunately we've settled too quickly on MOOCs and we've lost that goal of experimentation that at least I certainly initially attempted to promote. Now, the challenge though is that certain things, soft is hard and hard is easy, as a quote that a colleague of mine, John Drawn at Athabasca, references, and I think it's a very insightful statement that social systems are very hard to manage because you can't control the range of choices that individuals want to make. Hard things are easy. So taking a MOOC that follows the Coursera Udacity approach, where you clearly articulate the content, you develop your lectures, and you deliver those, that is something that is a technical issue. You can add a few quizzes, but overall it's a fairly easy process. The soft processes around that are very difficult. And I know both, at least in the US, the major MOOC providers, Coursera and edX, are both aggressively looking at ways to improve the communal aspect and the social aspect of learning. So this soft component of relationship building and knowledge generation, even though the current form of MOOCs don't advocate that extensively, that is an important component of what they're trying to do. At Athabasca, research by John Drawn and Terry Anderson promotes this in particular. I've been involved with them on this project, The Landing, which is a social network service for AU students to try and provide a little bit of that support and a little bit of that guidance, if you will. So from that lens, then, a university is this notion of assemblage of strangers that come together in one spot. That in an online space means something very different. And even the model of instruction that is heavily based or that is heavily influenced by the current prominent MOOC providers of faculty communicating content to learners needs to be augmented and replaced with something that looks a little bit more like this, where we have a mess of different partners and a mess of different players all doing different things and different kinds of activities and contributing in different ways at different levels as well. So we want much more of an integrated network model of education, but somehow this model has to preserve the ideals of the university without becoming a fragmented system where different values are emphasized, such as profit-taking instead of developing societal good. So a few quick thoughts. Second last slide here essentially is going forward then when we're talking about MOOCs, I think it's very difficult for anyone to really strongly say what MOOCs will and will not do to education right now. It's certainly settling more than it was even 6 months or a year ago. At that point, you could easily dismiss MOOCs, but that's not the case anymore, as you have major Chinese university groups joining Coursera and edX, as you have French national agencies selecting edX as a partner for learning delivery. You have systems like World Bank selecting Coursera. MOOCs, whether you like them or not, are making a dramatic impact and will continue to make a significant impact. Whether that impact is long-term or not, I'm not sure. I think we could probably state that the underlying trends, though, as I mentioned earlier, they're not going away. So if not MOOCs, it'll be something else, and it will be something that will move education toward a scalable, networked, global digital model. So there's various arguments around MOOCs, and we've probably spent more time discussing this today than you care to acknowledge, but essentially MOOCs are anything but settled. And if someone tells you this is what MOOCs are and this is the role MOOCs will play going forward, then if they're right in the future, it'll be because they're lucky, not because they're insightful, because there are far too many factors at play right now to enable us to say definitively what's going to happen with MOOCs. I've been reflecting lately on how much money has flown into the MOOC landscape. And I would say with a reasonable degree of comfort that if you evaluate the hard dollars from venture capitalists, the hard dollars assigned by universities and various agencies, we're approaching something in the range of a $500 million investment in MOOCs. And that doesn't even include the soft contributions such as paper writing and researching and the students that have taken MOOCs. It doesn't include that. We're talking hard dollars that have been contributed to MOOCs. And if that's a figure that, and I believe it's reasonably accurate, if that figure holds true, then it makes sense that we're not going to be able to just outright dismiss MOOCs and say, oh, well, we've seen this before, it's this type of learning, or we've seen that before, it's that type of learning. I think the danger that a lot of folks get into in the MOOC conversation is that MOOCs are not the thing to focus on. It's kind of if you have a patient that's ill on your table or in your operating table, or that's ill in your hospital, and you evidence, oh, this patient has a cough, that's not the cure. You've identified the symptom more or less. And I think MOOCs, if anything, are a symptom of changes in education. And it's risky to make any big decisions on that symptom. You really have to get underneath and look at some of those factors I emphasized earlier, where MOOCs reflect this changing student profile, changing knowledge configuration of society and employment, MOOCs reflect growing student populations, they reflect growing aging of student populations, and they reflect that long-rumored transition where education will become something that is lifelong and life-wide rather than something that is more of an episode that you do when you first exit high school. Now, for those of you that are randomly interested, I'm also involved in a MOOC research conference that we're holding at University of Texas in Arlington. If you go to moocresearch.com, you can link to the conference from there. There's some of the work from the Gates Foundation grant. We had a grant with them, $800,000 grant to look at early stage MOOC research and where it's going. So feel free to dive into that conference if you're interested. Otherwise, I'll pause there. I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So Kurt, I'll throw it over to you, see if you still have folks left in the room.
Thank you, George. Let's, first of all, before we go to Q&A, give George a round of applause. I don't know if he can hear us, but well, we started the day with about 100 people in the room, maybe much more, and I'm not sure, but we're at about 70 now here, George. So only 30 went gambling and shopping. Many came back in the room just to hear from you, so some people left and came back. Tom Rees is going to field questions down below. He has a microphone. I'll retell the question maybe from here, and if anyone would want to come right up here and speak directly to George, you're welcome just to come right up here and ask your question right up here. But Shobha has the first question.
Hi, I'm Shobha Bandi Rao, and I'm at the City University of New York. My question is, what are students' expectations before they take a MOOC course? I'm kind of looking for some information on that, and I couldn't find any online. So what are students' expectations if those students who have never taken a MOOC course before? Are they expecting something? What are they expecting?
What are students expecting from a MOOC course is their question. Did you get that, George?
Well, yeah, I did. Yes, thank you. I think this is very challenging because in universities, historically, and by historically, literally up until about a decade ago, we had a fairly homogenous type of profile of the student. And it was typically the majority, I would say the vast majority, would be students that were sequential, from high school into higher education. And so we could talk about that university as a singular, or that student as a singular entity. We could create a fairly accurate profile and apply that to a variety of students. Today, we can't do that because the MOOC takers range dramatically. We have people who do it for professional learning. We have people who do it for employment. We have people who take, let's say, a statistics MOOC so that they can do a better job at their, or get better grades at their statistics course within the university where they're registered, but they like the teaching format that's self-controlled rather than one where you attend a classroom at set times. So it's almost impossible, I think, to give a profile of a MOOC student today because the MOOC takers are so broad and such a diverse group. So I'm going to take a non-answer to that one and say that for students who are engaged in MOOCs right now, the interests are varied. They are diverse, everything from employment to personal enjoyment to personal satisfaction. One of the images I showed earlier is where, 2010, where we are today and where we'll be in another 30, 40 years, the changing profile of people involved in, or how long people live, I should say. So when you have people who are now living to 90 plus, are expected to be a growing percentage of the population in the next while, if that's the population profile that holds out, and if you compare that with statistics that we hear about, an average person is going to have 5 or 6 different types of careers in their lifetime. If those stats hold out, it'll be even more difficult going forward to address this profile of the student. And much of my presentation was an argument that says universities have narrowly focused on the traditional student profile, but everything in society has required growing learning needs in the last several decades. That's the new profile of the student, are those students that no longer fit that traditional profile universities have to start acknowledging.
Okay, thank you, George. We'll go to the second question.
Terrific, thank you. My name is Paul Boudwin. I am a teacher at Fitchburg State University. And I was wondering this, one of the things that we've been talking about here is the kind of technology that we're using. And some people are talking about the learning management system as being an impediment. A lot of us see that the LMS is an institution-based resource and as such hard technology. We're looking to find ways to incorporate social media, moving education away from the learning management system to a kind of student-mediated system, a kind of soft technology. I'm wondering, in what ways can social networking be incorporated into either MOOCs or e-learning in general?
Okay, so Paul from Pittsburgh State, who took my MOOC last year, he teaches music. He has his own Wikipedia page. You can check him out up there. He's written his own music. He asks about, we're stuck with these systems, learning management systems, but yet we're in a culture or educational times where social media and other technologies have a chance to enhance the learning, yet our universities are strapping us down with set requirements to use this system. Is that your general question? And how do we move beyond that? Or how do faculty deal with such times? Social networking. How do we get to social networking when our universities don't allow for it?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and I think for higher education that may well end up being one of the big research questions going forward. And let's go scale back here a little bit. That was the whole spirit behind the landing, which was the recognition. Now, the landing is based on the open source Elk software, and for lack of a better word, it's social media in a box. It has everything from, Pinterest-like functionality to Twitter to Facebook to file sharing. But the interested students, we have a certain care or duty of care to students, which means we can't have a group of students joining higher education that might not be aware of the impact of digital media or social media, or they may want to segregate different parts of their life into different profiles. So one temporary or one in-transit activity might be for universities to begin adopting something similar to what we did with the landing, where it is a closed network space. It is an area where students can do all of the networking that you expect to be able to do in a university or on the open web, but it does so in a way that provides a greater degree of cover, if you will, or support where students are still developing those skills. But I absolutely agree. I mean, the question of how, outside of something like this, it's a challenge because more universities are placing either guidelines or restrictions on how social media or social networks are used. I remember mid-2000, if I was teaching a course, an average person that I was interacting with administratively didn't know what blogs were, by 2006, 2007, didn't know what Twitter was. And so ignorance gives you a lot of latitude for experimentation. Now that there are issues rising around the role of social networks and social media in the education sector and the privacy issues, the ethics around that use, it's becoming far more complex. We are tied to our learning management system so far, but as I mentioned, there are a few promising examples. The domain of one's own, the MOOCs that Stephen Downs and I have done that have, I think, at least communicated the value of learning in network systems as a creative process rather than as a duplicate process. But beyond that, I really can't provide a specific response to how can we respond to the pushback that social media and social networks are receiving in the university structure.
Okay, we're going to go to about 10:02 for Q&A, and we'll have a wrap-up, give away books at the end here for the last 10 minutes. So we have time for maybe 3 more questions. We have a woman from University of Minnesota,
Christiana Riley.
Christiana, yeah.
From University of Minnesota. My question is around a paradigm shift that you have helped us start thinking about distributed knowledge and how that's challenging the broadcast model, the role of the university, the role of the teacher, the way that has changed from the regular classroom delivery to online, that the teacher is no longer the sage on the stage, but more of the facilitator of a lot of different learning resources. And I wonder if there's another paradigm shift, and that is what is required of the learner, that the learner no longer be a consumer, but also become an active learner. So the idea of taking and sharing back, and maybe in a MOOC, if the learning management system allowed it, requires a more horizontal leadership where the students take active roles, and that might help scale the experience. And that students might sign up for roles in courses. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, the notion is that the teacher role, instructor role has changed dramatically from a production and distribution model to more of an active, engaging, connected world, but the student role has also changed. And so I missed the last half. Tom, you want to repeat that?
It was the notion of do the learners have more responsibility, and are they going to step up to the plate? You know, we've conditioned learners, they come into kindergarten so excited, just wanting to learn, and by the time they leave high school, they're passive and, you know, actually try to avoid learning in a formal sense.
Okay, I got it.
And so...
Yeah, so the notion is that we've conditioned people to be passive. How do we shift today? What are the ways in which we're going to shift to a model where they're more active and taking more responsibility for their learning, more self-determined learning and self-directed learning? How can this happen, George?
That's certainly a relevant question, and actually it's a question that's been relevant since the days of Bandura and Brunner and others, and even Vygotsky going back. But you know, certainly this notion of self-efficacy and personal control and personal ownership in the learning process, that's not new, and that's not a new challenge. And self-regulated learning is a fairly developed research space as well. So it's not that these are completely new questions that we're facing. The opportunities around it, I think if we want students to become self-regulated and autonomous learners, and learners who promote who are promote self-efficacy and who are willing to embrace and take on challenges, we have to give them learning experiences that occur in the wild, if you will, rather than in these self-contained, sanitized learning experiences they now have in our classrooms or that they now have in the learning management system. So I think from an education perspective, the first activity that we need to engage in is to push students into thinking sort of in the lines of what Carl Breiter and Marlene Scargnelli have emphasized around knowledge generation, so that even at a young age, learners are seen not to duplicate the knowledge of what is already known, but to be actively engaged in contributing to and developing new knowledge, even at a young age. There's nothing that says you have to be in a master's program before you contribute to a knowledge base. So I think that's one approach to doing it. It's obviously multifaceted, so I have a hard time sort of giving you steps 1 through 12 to become and create your own self-motivated learner. But it's worth emphasizing that the questions we're asking have been well considered in a lot of learning research literature, certainly around distance education, online learning as well. So what we need to do most is to begin visiting the problems we see in MOOCs through the lens of existing learning sciences research. I think we'll get a lot of insight there rather than assuming we have to build a knowledge base from scratch.
Thank you, George. We have 2 more questions left in the room. Raise your hands. Who's got a question for George? Time for... Tom Reeves has a question. We'll wrap it with Tom Reeves' question then. Tom, why don't you come up and ask him yourself? Right?
Okay.
You probably missed Tom Reeves, so we'll...
Hey, George. I'm wondering, you know, you guys got this great MOOC thing rolling up in Canada, and then, you know, a lot of folks down here kind of stole the thunder, if you will, in some ways. And so a couple questions. One, when are you going to do your next Connectivist MOOC? Because I really think they're...
I think we just lost him.
Oh. We're trying to be creative here.
Well, that's the audio. Michael, you still in the room? George, can you still hear us?
Can you hear us, George? Is it the microphone?
Can you hear us, George?
Now I can, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So when are you going to do your next Connectivist MOOC? And number 2, with respect to this MOOC research conference, it's going to be in Texas, which baffles me, but nonetheless, where's the really exciting research going on in this whole MOOC space?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's great to see you again, Tom. It's been a while since we've actually talked in person, but we've had a few exchanges over the last few years, so life seems to be going well on your end from the email exchanges. So first of all, I think it's worth emphasizing that as Canadians, we are plotting our impending invasion of the U.S. moocosphere. But unfortunately, the difficulty when you get Canadians plotting in military strategies, we usually have to take our weaponry out of our museums. So I think that's a bit of a challenge. So to get to your question, though, the next Connectivism MOOC, it's a good question. I'm in Doha next week with Stephen Downs, and we actually have an opportunity there to connect and chat a bit. So we will be picking up that conversation we'll be there for the WISE conference. So I will definitely direct that conversation at him. We don't have anything planned at this stage. The second question around where's interesting stuff happening in MOOC research. There's so much going on right now, but let me just drop a link in. I know you probably won't be able to see it on your screens, but if you go to moocresearch.com/blog, you'll see a list of the grants that have been awarded for this particular research project. I'm just going to drop it, it might not show up. So those are the research activities that we've funded. Now I'm doing 2 online presentations this week. They're open, so I imagine most of you at the conference won't. You'll be busy actually doing real live fun stuff like interacting with colleagues rather than looking at a desktop. But I'll be presenting the early results of what we call a structured mapping of MOOC literature, which is looking at what are the prominent MOOC home disciplines, like where are academics coming from that are now doing MOOC research, computer science, artificial intelligence, education faculty, sociology, where are these thinkers coming from? So that's point 1. From a structured mapping end. We'll also be doing a citation analysis of the prominent resources, and we'll be looking at which authors have been the most significant contributors. Now, a lot of that isn't necessarily talking about what's next, what's the new research. Most of that is looking at what's the landscape right now. I think going forward, the things that I've seen that are more promising is what's coming out of, Coursera and edX are paying a lot of attention to the communal aspects of MOOCs, making them more responsive to the experience of the individual learner. There's growing attention being paid to, even though I haven't seen any solutions, but around adaptive learning and adaptive content provision. There's also a number of initiatives such as, and I'm very happy to see systems like iVersity, the groups out of Latin America that are starting to deliver MOOCs, because I think what we need is a multitude of MOOC players so that we have some competition and we can start to learn from each other's approaches, whether they're pedagogic approaches or marking and evaluation, how groups are formed, peer evaluation. So really right now, almost everything in the MOOC landscape is interesting research. The problem is we have to move past duplicating what we already know about online learning. I saw a few months ago, Sebastian Throon from Udacity was presenting at a conference about all the wonderful new pedagogies that they're discovering. And my response to that was, list every new pedagogy you've discovered, and I'll give you half a dozen research articles dating back 30 years that probably made those discoveries. So MOOC researchers have to do a better job connecting what they're doing now with what's already known about research in learning and social learning and distance and online learning. So that, I think, once we get that mix right, once we get the data mining techniques and methods of the current large-scale MOOC providers combined with what's already known around social learning and broadly known within the learning sciences, that's, I think, we're going to start to see some true innovation rather than just walking old ground again. And I know with the work that you've done with design-based research, you're well aware of some of these issues around research methods that churn but don't actually have an impact. So I think we have to do a much better job as researchers in the MOOC landscape in moving from understanding MOOCs to beginning to make an actual impact on the lives of members.
George, that was excellent. I hope you can still hear us.
Yep, I still do.
And you can still see. This is how we're doing this talk today with Paul Kim. Let's thank Paul Kim for arranging this talk at the last second. We had no internet in the hotel, but Paul's our opening keynote, and he helps us with the closing keynote. He actually stole something from me to do this, my adapter. So he's got my phone adapter plugged in, so his phone charges here. So he's using this as a network. So this is, we are innovative. That took us a few minutes to do, but George, I'm sure glad we were able to connect with you because I wasn't ready. I was the backup. So, so thank you for your patience, and want to thank George Siemens. Everyone, again, give George Siemens a round of applause. And we will, you want any parting final comment, George?
Just a quick thing. Sorry I missed Paul's opening talk as well. I'm not sure if there's any recordings available, but I caught a few of the tweets, so that was great. And just a quick thank you, Kurt, and the organizing committee for the opportunity to present here. Apologies I wasn't able to be there in Vegas, but I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference, and hopefully get a chance to cross paths again soon, Kurt.
And George was here in Vegas 5 years ago with us. George, where are your slides going to be posted? Are they at your SlideShare site, or can you send them to us?
Sure, I'll fire you a copy of the slides and you can do what you will with them.
Okay, and this was recorded. Paul's was recorded. We will make this available so you can see what Paul had to say, and our panels were recorded and so forth and so on. So these will all be available to you. And my backup talk is posted at trainingshare.com. If you're interested in what I would have said had the internet not, had Paul not saved us, you can go to trainingshare.com for some of the panel questions and what I had for backup under archive talks, even though I never gave it. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, George. We're going to disconnect here and go to a final closing wrap-up. Thank you, George. And I'm going to wave goodbye, if that's okay.
All right, take care, all.
Thank you, George. Wish you were here. Bye-bye. Everyone wave. We'll get everyone to wave. Hopefully I won't disconnect. Everyone give him another round of applause and wave. He can see you a little bit there. We've got some 70-odd people from 20-some countries. So thank you again. Bye-bye.